This is just an idyllic scene from the Middle Ages. Three buddies having fun flying their kite. Until you realize that the kite is dropping a bomb over a populated city. This illustration of an incendiary kite is found in a book from 1326. This work was written by Walter de Millimetti, who was commissioned by Queen Isabella of France to write a treatise on kingship for her son, the Prince of England, who would later become King Edward III. This specific scene was included at the end of the book alongside other siege engines and illustrations of sieges. This book also includes one of the first depictions of the use of cannons in Europe, and as far as we can tell, all the other things he has drawn here are tactics that we know to have been used in siege warfare. So this depiction of an aerial bombardment seems out of place, as it is the only tactic not accounted for in any other conflict from medieval Europe. Fire kites using black powder and a fuse of incense were used in China, however. These were known as fire crows and were often also made in the shape of a crow. These weren't kites as such. While you could definitely attach a string to them, they were generally thrown to the opponent, more like a paper airplane. There are mentions of flocks of these so-called fire crows being thrown, causing a rain of explosives over the enemy troops. The Chinese also developed rocket-propelled arrows, and these could be combined into what we would nowadays refer to as a rocket launcher. As a sort of combination between the fire crow and these rocket arrows, they also developed a dragon-shaped aerial weapon. Thought to be mainly used in sea battles, this dragon would first be propelled into the air using rocket arrows. Then, when the propelling charges were running out, it would automatically light the fuses of rocket-powered projectiles that would shoot out of the dragon's mouth towards the targets below. Walter's work was written a few decades after Marco Polo returned from China. So could it be that, based on accounts from China, something like this was actually tried in Europe, and perhaps this did not go well, thus not being adopted in European warfare and consequently lost to history? It is possible, but we can't say where he got this idea from for sure. I'll come back to fire kites later, as there is another depiction by another artist that illustrates something similar. For now though, we will take a look at another illustration from Walter de Millimetti's work. Because although we know the tactics depicted here were used in real life, it doesn't mean that they weren't a bit odd. This, for example, appears to be some sort of four-armed fire-throwing weapon. Although the artist here seems to have taken some creative liberties. While the practice of throwing flammable projectiles did occur, four-armed machines like this did not exist. Instead, common artillery machines could just be used to fire these flammable payloads. These could be barrels or other types of containers made from wood, terracotta or glass, filled with flammable materials such as pitch or animal fat, which were designed to smash on impact to release a blaze of fire. And after black powder was introduced to Europe, this could also be used to give a more explosive impact to these projectiles. Although the use of gunpowder was mainly reserved for cannons, as these were more efficient. The device dropped here by the kite is likely to be a bomb or incendiary similar to those that were already used for these purposes, and I imagine if they did try to drop it by kite, while it does look a lot more fun, they would have soon realized that it was much easier and more efficient to continue using the conventional methods of catapulting these payloads over the walls. Another odd method of setting a city on fire is found in the famous story of Olga of Kiev, who, while besieging her enemies the Drevlians, agreed with them to lift the siege for a small price. All she asked for was 3 pigeons and sparrows of each house in the city. The Drevlians obliged, but later that night she had slow-burning fuses attached to the birds before releasing them. The birds, heading back to their nests in those homes to roost, spread the incendiary charges throughout the city, starting fires all over. Setting animals on fire was not an uncommon idea, as the Romans famously sent flaming pigs out towards enemy lines to sow panic and confusion. However, there is a problem. Both Olga's account as well as that of the Romans were written down hundreds of years after the events they reference took place, and there is no contemporary evidence that indicates that these tactics were actually used. Even though these stories were just legends, the thought of using animals in this way was never far from our minds. Late medieval war engineers commonly brought up the concept of strapping bombs or incendiaries to all kinds of animals and subsequently send them running towards the enemy. This was most commonly depicted to be done with horses and dogs, but in a German work called the Fire Book, from just after the Middle Ages, there's also a depiction of strapping bombs to birds and cats. Luckily, these types of tactics seem to have never been put into practice, and when you think about it, it's easy to see why. Not only does it seem extremely cruel, there is also the issue of controlling the animals. How do you ensure that they don't just turn back and run amok among your own troops? Frantic animals often can't be easily controlled. And imagine how frantic these animals would become if they were actively set on fire. I can't imagine you could get them to run neatly in a straight line towards the enemy. So far we've covered throwing fireballs and sending fire to the enemy using animals. So if we make this a trifecta, the last corner would be flinging animals towards the enemy, which is what we will cover now. It is well known that this was done using rotten and diseased carcasses, which were thrown into besieged cities to spread illness. But you might be surprised to learn that living animals were used as well. Going back to Walter de Millimetti's book, we find an illustration of beehives being used as projectiles, and in fact there were several instances in which beehives were used as weapons in real life. Although, again, I think some creative liberties were expressed here, as I don't believe they used windmills to do it. Attackers could use catapults to fling them into a city, but defenders used this tactic as well, to throw beehives down onto people trying to climb up to the walls. In the 1400s, a new style of engineerical writing developed, where inventors would draw their inventions instead of describing them with text alone. This style is best known from the works of Leonardo da Vinci, but before him, some of the first to use this style were the Bohemian Konrad Kyeser, as well as the Italian Mariano di Jacopo, also known as Taccola. They, along with depicting conventional siege engines, also came up with some interesting new inventions and tactics of their own. Taccola devised up some tricks for deception, but as far as we know, these were never put into practice. He suggested to attach a set of horseshoes backwards onto a horse's feet, then sneakily ride out of a besieged castle without the enemy spotting you, of course, and then, when eventually the enemy discovers the tracks, instead of leading out of the castle, the tracks will look like they actually head towards the castle. This will make the enemy think reinforcements have arrived to aid the defenders, making them paranoid in the process. In another, he suggests that when abandoning a watchtower or castle, to leave a dog behind, attach a rope from the dog to a bell tower, and then leave some food and water out at a further distance, so when the dog goes to eat or drink, the rope is pulled which rings the bell. When the enemy is in the area, upon hearing this they will assume the fortification is still manned, and waste their time trying to take it. Taccola also seems to have been a big fan of unicorns, as he doodles them in a few places throughout his notebook. Oh wait, no, these were actually designs to put spikes onto a horse's head to then ride towards the enemy and impale them. There is also this wagon of sorts in the shape of a unicorn-like monster with a movable head. And then there's this artillery device that appears to be designed to launch cluster bombs. This big arrow with a container attached would be shot into the air, and when this container opened, it could release a batch of arrows or even a cluster of small bombs. Apart from war machines, he did also work on designing structures relating to water flow and hydraulics. He was employed by the Italian city of Siena to maintain their water supply, so this was a field he had a lot of experience in. In some instances, he brought this knowledge to siege tactic propositions as well. In one example, Taccola detailed the design of a siphon for a castle to draw up water from a nearby lake or river, store a sizable amount within the castle. Then, when it was besieged, the defenders could release this water through a hole in the wall, presumably to flush the enemy back and away from the fort. Historians have, however, questioned the seriousness of some of his designs, as will be particularly evident in the next illustrations I'll cover. Here he shows an underwater scene. At another point in his work, he shares extensive designs of underwater breathing apparatuses to aid divers into staying underwater for longer while performing tasks such as harbor maintenance or salvaging shipwrecks. But with this one, he takes it a step further. He shows a knight with one of these breathing devices riding an ox underwater. How the ox is breathing, or why the knight has a fish as a leg, is unclear. The caption that accompanies this drawing says the following: "I keep to myself what I know. Do not fancy that you can do these things without me, the silver-bearing ass." This is basically the 15th century version of a paywall. As with this, he means to say not everything he knows will be revealed in this work, and if an interested party wants to know how to achieve this, the inventor will only disclose his secrets to them for money. Speaking of money, if you like what I do, please consider supporting me on Patreon or YouTube memberships, or you can also leave a donation through super thanks on this video. There are also other free ways to support me, so you can like, comment and subscribe, which will make the YouTube algorithm suggest this video to more people. There is an even more wacky illustration where a knight rides a fish. Here the caption reads roughly to the same effect. "I know what I am doing on the swimming fish. I feed him oil from the sponge as spittle for the fish while riding him. He has in himself what supports him and what is supported by him. Nothing in the capitula on harbour gear and defences can be brought to perfection without me. My speech is veiled. Many a thing I have acquired with long labour shall not be known at once. What I say here I say because of the ingratitude of the people, who are less than human. The rest reposes in my mind." Now we'll move on from this Italian work and we'll have a look at the Bohemian. Konrad Kyeser was a contemporary of Taccola, and his work similarly includes real and established war machines, as well as ones of his own design. He also includes war wagons, which were famously used during the Hussite Wars that took place not long after he completed his work. Along with conventional war wagon designs, we also find this one, which is in the shape of a dragon or a monster, with a spike or a blade protruding from its mouth. Depictions of this machine vary, depending on which edition of the book you look at. It is worth noting that these works were copied by hand, so illustrations can vary slightly from version to version. In this one it is depicted as staking out a whole tower, but in others this war machine appears to be of a more realistic size. The design of this wagon may be related to another of his tactics, as Kyeser included magic alongside conventional weapons. In his work, he presents summoning demons to aid in siege warfare as a viable tactic. In this illustration, the guy in the tower is blowing his horn to summon demons, and those demons can be seen at the bottom heading towards the castle. In another version of this illustration, however, it looks more like these demons are about to set fire to the castle, so I suppose demons could be used by both the defenders and the attackers. He also includes an illustration of a demon head weapon. It is unclear if this demon face was meant to summon actual demons or just intended to scare the opponent. He also includes superstitions, such as claiming that geese make great guards. This alludes to an ancient legend in which a goose honked at enemy Gauls who tried to sneak into Rome. He also mentions dogs to be good for this purpose, which if I had to choose I'd rather rely on a guard dog over a goose. Then, as I promised earlier, we come back around to the kites. Kyeser also depicts what looks like an incendiary kite, but if this was based on something real like the Chinese dragon-shaped weapon or just something he came up with, we can't say for sure. It has some differences to the kite we saw in Walter's work earlier. Kyeser's design is in the shape of a dragon, and instead of dropping bombs, it seems to have been intended for it to breathe fire. A flamethrower conception of sorts had already been thought up by him elsewhere in his work, where he talks about a metal statue of a man that, when heated up, spouts flames from his mouth. This is most likely not intended to be a weapon, however, as this seems more gimmicky. In this section he also describes a statue of a woman with mirrors on her breasts, and when men come up to look at them, she blows soot in their faces. Which of these tactics was your favorite? Let me know in the comments below. Subscribe to my channel if you're interested in more siege tactic videos. The link to the playlist is on screen right now. I'd like to thank my patrons for their support, especially my $25 patron, G. David.